Mirrors by Greensearcher, Chapter 3.
Dr. Matthews, do you have a moment? I believe I'm growing ill.
The ear trumpet turned towards his master, humming seriously.
Well, please, have a seat, my lord, he instructed.
The beast sat slowly in the armchair beside him, breathing deeply as he folded his paws in his lap.
What are your symptoms? The doctor asked. My heart's pounding all the time, the master said nervously, and my face feels hot sometimes. I just can't catch my breath.
Matthews began to smile.
I see. When did this begin? He asked.
The beast pursed his lips.
A few days ago.
Ah! The ear trumpet replied stoically.
So about the time the young lady joined us. Yes, I suppose so, the master agreed,
oblivious to the implication.
I thought it would go away, but it's only grown worse.
The doctor shouldn't have smiled so. His master seemed legitimately worried. Well, let's have a listen.
If you wouldn't mind, my lord.
The beast tugged open his shirt before carefully picking up the ear trumpet and pressing him against his chest. It certainly wasn't what the tool was intended for, but one had to adapt these days.
Heartbeat is a bit quick, but steady, Matthews muttered to himself before speaking up. So tell me, my lord, how is the mademoiselle? Adapting to her work here, I take it?
The pulse quickened further, and the doctor sensed the master was swallowing roughly.
Yes, I believe so.
Grinning, the ear horn continued as though nothing were amiss. A little to the right, master.
Ah, yes, strong lungs as well.
Everything sounds as clear as a whistle, he finished as the beast pulled him away.
I shouldn't be too concerned, my lord.
Indeed, such symptoms are quite a normal response for someone in your situation. The beast cocked his head in confusion, pausing his vain attempts to fit the little buttons of his blouse back into their holes.
It should calm in time, the horn replied vaguely. Oh, all right, the master said,
scratching his chin before standing up and padding to the door.
Dr. Matthews chuckled to himself. To think the boy's just now experiencing attraction, he thought with warmth. Well, it's about time.
Master! The beast looked up, a large bundle of stalks in one hand and a rough old scythe in the other. He stood tall, looking over the rows of golden wheat, a small hand waving from beyond the heads of grass. My lord, are you there? Bell called out.
I'm here. Just a moment,
he said, sliding the blade into his belt and laying the fresh stalks on a pile before pushing his way out of the field. On his way he passed several other mobile tools as they helped harvest the crops. Emerging from the stalks, he saw Belle standing in the dirt, the book she had borrowed the day before pressed against her chest with one arm as she held her hair out of her eyes in the strong autumn winds. She looked at him in bewilderment, and he was suddenly aware of his appearance. Wolf-like feet coated in mud, no doubt pieces of grass stuck in his fur. He hadn't bothered with his coat that day. The sleeves rolled up to the elbows and a few buttons undone. He realized were exposing his fur-coated chest.
Is everything all right?
He asked, making an awkward attempt to tame the wild mane before wrestling with his undone shirt. Yes, she said slowly, still looking puzzled as she took in the sight. Mrs. Potts said I could find you here. She trailed off, looking out over the small field. What are you doing, my lord? She asked blankly. He raised a brow.
Aren't you a farmer's daughter?
He asked in some amusement. I mean, you're helping with the harvest. He couldn't help but smile at her shock.
We've let some of the class status slide around here over the years, he explained before holding up his paws. Also, opposable thumbs. I can clear half the field in the same time it takes the others to finish a row, he said quietly, not wanting to offend the servants behind him. To his surprise, she chuckled. That's very good of you, Master Leon. Registering the name's origin, Lion, and ignoring it, he went on. Well, I'm the only one here who eats, he shrugged. You said you needed something? Oh, yes. Belle held out the book to him with both hands. I wanted to return this, she explained, before noticing his dirty paws and pulling it back. But perhaps I should just leave it somewhere for you. The beast hadn't heard the last few words, frowning. I'm sorry you didn't like it, he said, feeling a little foolish. Belle looked aghast. What? No, I loved it, she exclaimed, looking back down at the novel and brushing her hand over the corner. It might be my new favourite, in fact.
The master's eyes grew wide.
Really?
She nodded eagerly. He felt his heart quicken for a moment before coming to himself.
Hold on, you already finished it?
He asked in disbelief.
Did you even sleep last night?
Well, not actually, she admitted sheepishly. I have little self-control when it comes to books, I'm afraid. The beast found himself smiling, thinking of all the times he had done the same himself. But do you like some help? Belle asked suddenly. The skies are growing dark. It'd be a shame if those fresh-cut stalks were ruined by the rain tonight. The idea sounded nice, but the beast only furrowed his brows.
It's already getting late. You should probably head back. I can't finish on my own.
No, I'll help. It won't take long if we work together, she said, pulling off her cloak and wrapping the book inside before setting both down carefully on a nearby stump. Hiking up her skirt, Belle trampled past him into the mud and quickly disappeared in between the tall stalks. The master stood in a daze for a long moment before chuckling to himself and following her inside. Half an hour later, they had brought in the entirety of the cut stalks into the storage barn. The beast laid the last stack on the floor and sighed.
That did go fast, he said gratefully.
I told you it would, she grinned before scanning the inside of the barn. Do you want to hang them? It looks like you have hooks in place. The wheat will dry faster that way.
The master nodded. I've tried, but...
He stopped, clenching and unclenching his large paws.
Well, I just can't seem to tie the knots together very well.
Belle's mouth formed a small O in understanding, before continuing with resolve. In that case, I'll tie them up, and if you hang them. I still have some time. The beast lost track of the hour as they worked, the old wheelbarrow bringing in another load now and then, but eventually disappearing along with the rest of the servants, which, of course, was likely intentional. The master didn't mind, however, listening intently as Belle started to talk about her favourite parts of the story he had lent her. And I couldn't believe he was the prince in disguise all along, she was saying excitedly.
Yes, quite surprising,
the master said awkwardly, clearing his throat. I should have seen it coming, though, she went on. I mean, looking back, it was so obvious. She continued talking as they worked, and the beast was surprised at some of the symbolism she had pointed out, things he had never noticed even after a dozen read-throughs. She stopped suddenly. Sorry, am I boring you? I'm probably boring you, she rambled, brushing her hand across her apron as she looked away.
No,
he answered honestly, that newfound warmth filling his chest again.
No, not at all.
She looked relieved, though a bit unconvinced as she remained silent, tying up the last bundle of wheat and handing it to him.
I'm glad you enjoyed it,
he went on, hanging it beside the others.
I would offer you another, but I'd rather not encourage poor sleeping habits.
You have more? Belle interrupted eagerly. The beast grinned a bit.
A few.
Before he could go on, darkness suddenly filled the large barn as early evening settled over them. A feeling of guilt swept over him as he realised how late it had grown. I'd better go prepare for the leap for the ride home, she said with some reluctance, tying her cloak around her shoulders and moving towards the door.
Belle, you're welcome to stay though.
At that moment, a flash of light and a loud crack of thunder shot from the darkness as rain began pouring down on the roof.
You should definitely stay the night,
he said blankly. I suppose so, she confessed, pursing her lips. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be a burden. I just got carried away with what we were doing and...
It's no trouble, he said quickly. And there's no shortage of guest rooms. And besides, it was nice too.
He stopped, a bit of shyness sweeping over him as he stared at his feet. He wanted to tell her how nice it had been to spend the afternoon together, but couldn't find the courage.
It was, nice to have the help, he amended. We couldn't have finished before the rain without you.
She smiled warmly as she looked out the open door to the half-harvested fields, the golden stalks dim amid the pouring rain. I didn't think I'd get to do this year, she said vaguely, leaning up against the frame and glancing back at him. Help with the harvest, I mean. My parents and I used to take in the wheat every autumn together. That is until... She trailed off, eyes looking a little glassy as she turned to look back outside.
Belle? He asked anxiously. Are you...
Forgive me, my lord, she said, quickly shaking her head. So foolish to miss them already. It's hardly been a week. The beast felt a new flood of memories at her word.
It's not foolish, he said quietly. The beginning of missing someone. It's always the worst part.
She bit her lip, dabbing her eyes against her sleeve and sucking in a deep breath. A bit of moisture remained on her cheeks as she pulled her arm away, hair falling from its ribbon and bits of straw clinging to her clothes. Yet she seemed even more beautiful to him than when he had first appeared.
"Would you like to see the library?"
he asked after a moment, suddenly desperate to see her smile again. He got his wish immediately. "My dear, you are soaked to the bone!" the teapot cried, hurrying them into the kitchen and shouting to the others to bring in a load of towels as she poured Belle and the master 2 cups of tea where they sat. "You'll need to get out of those wet clothes and into something dry this instant!" The beast looked suddenly embarrassed, glancing away in the opposite direction very quickly. "Anne!" Mrs. Potts went on, shouting towards the hall. A small serving tray appeared in the doorway. "Wheel upstairs and tell the girls to start heating up the water. We'll run a bath." The teapot turned to the beast, raising a painted brow. "Master, you better go dry yourself off."
"Mrs. Potts,"
he said between gritted teeth, looking at her in irritation. Come, we can't have that water soaking into the floor," she said frankly, eyeing the trails of dripping from his fur. He sighed, standing and heading back out of the door. They had come in to stand under the balcony. Belle heard what sounded like 100 drops of water splatter against the window before he came back inside, fur suddenly dry and sticking out in all directions. It took her a great deal of effort not to laugh as he attempted to pat it all back down into place. Instead, she hid a smile behind her teacup, amused, as she realized the master might not actually be the one in charge around here after all. "Now, let's see. Which room shall we put you in?" Mrs. Potts went on, turning back to Belle. "The lilac room is quite lovely, though it tends to run cold this time of year. I suppose there is the bleu room. I heard Queen Marie was quite fond of that one." Oh, Belle said shyly, flushing a bit as the woman's words registered in her mind. "Won't I? I mean, shouldn't I just stay in the servants' quarters, Mrs. Potts?" "Stay in the... Nonsense! None of us stay in there any more as it is," she said absently, listing a few more of the grand rooms to herself as Belle sat in shock. She almost missed the last present move an inch closer beside her on the bench.
"Belle?"
the beast whispered as Mrs. Potts went on to herself. "Yes, master?"
"What's your favourite colour?" he asked.
She cocked her head. "Pardon?" He looked a bit embarrassed, but only shrugged. Well, it's yellow, actually," she answered honestly, perplexed by the strange question.
"Really?"
he replied with a look of interest, though he didn't inquire further as he sat up and stopped Mrs. Potts from her rambling.
"I think the gold room would be best,"
he directed, standing and rubbing the back of his neck as he padded quickly out of the door. Not half an hour later, Belle found herself in a warm bath, little bubbles skimming the water's surface and a sweet, flowery smell gracing the air. She was in a bright, shining bathroom, nearly as large as her entire home. Mirrors rimmed with golden carvings and floors laid with fine marble. Belle shut her eyes for a long moment before opening again. Still here, she thought to herself, in utter shock at the luxury surrounding her. She took in a deep breath and pulled her head beneath the surface, letting her hair soak up the clean water and trying to figure out how she had found herself here. The adjacent room was nearly 3 times as large as the bathroom. An enormous bed with tall oak frames, warm yellow sheets stitched with intricate details. The detail in every item of the room was breathtaking. The gold-painted stucco patterns lining the walls. The beautiful circular mural of cherubs in the ceiling centre. The soft Persian rug beneath her feet. The grand mirror over the hearth. Even the little glass clock on the mantel had an elegance of its own. Belle was certain she could spend a day alone, simply admiring it all. She soon resurfaced, rubbing some of the suds into her scalp and humming pleasantly. "Can I offer you anything, mademoiselle?" a small comb said shyly from the counter. Belle nearly laughed. She couldn't imagine anything that could make this better. "No, this is wonderful. Thank you," she said simply. "Is this what aristocrats do every day?" she thought to herself in amusement, sinking back down to her nose in the water and trying, quite literally, to soak up as much as she could from the moment. Only the thought of the mystery library could pull her away from the warm bath. "I wonder if it's much larger than the one in the village," she thought with naivety, in awe at the kind of home that owned enough books that they required a whole room to hold them. Drying herself off quickly, she was convinced by a very persistent wardrobe to wear a beautiful green dinner gown, before kneeling beside the hearth to dry her hair. As she did, she took in her surroundings again, realizing that despite their finery, there remained an elegance of comfort in the setting only accentuated by the fire's glow. Belle was trying not to imagine how the dress alone likely cost more than her entire house, when a quiet tap tap came from the door. The comb from before offered her a pretty ribbon, which she pulled quickly through her hair before opening up the door. In the hall, the master stood off to the side, eyes growing wide at the sight of her. Hair still a bit damp, she assumed she must look a bit dishevelled.
Mademoiselle, you look stunning! Simply stunning!
A voice called out, and Belle was surprised to see Monsieur Lumiere held aloft in the beast's paw, his flames the only source of light in the dark hall. Thank you, Belle said a little shyly, though I'm sure it's the dress's doing, monsieur. The master was still staring as she looked back at him, when his eyes suddenly flew towards the ceiling, then the floor, then over to the balcony before he spoke.
I thought I could. He cleared his throat. Well, Mrs. Potts suggested I escort you. To dinner, I mean. Then the library. It's easy to get lost if you don't know the way.
Yes, the library is quite grand, Lumiere cut in, waving a golden arm around, in enthusiasm. But what really is impressive is the ballroom. Oh, what I would give to see it put to use again. The beast cleared his throat to stop him, motioning to the right as he shut the door behind them and led her down the wide passageway. The beast looked down at the dishes in front of him. Several plates of various sizes sat in careful arrangement beneath a bowl of steaming soup. An assortment of glasses with different drinks and cups of tea arranged at the top, while a dozen utensils lay on either side. He was certain just trying to pick up any of the items up with his paws would send the entire place setting crashing to the floor.
Who did this?
He thought irritably, wondering how in the world anyone expected him to eat this way. Feeling a bead of sweat dripping down his neck, the master looked up at Belle from across the long table. To his surprise, she looked just as anxious as he felt. My lord? She asked quietly, a nervous whisper echoing off the near-empty dining room. I'm sorry, but which spoon am I supposed to use? His irritability melted away in a moment.
I cannot recall, he grinned quietly.
You don't usually eat like this? Belle asked in surprise.
The beast smiled further. No, never.
She looked a bit relieved.
I'm afraid we've become the victims of Lumiere's tendency to overdo things.
He went on, to a few chuckles from the footmen occupying their dozen candlesticks along the table's surface. Soon the unnecessary utensils were cleared away. The beast was trying his best not to look completely ridiculous, using his remaining spoon, when she heard a small voice from across the table. Hello? Belle was whispering to the spoon in her hand. She pulled it close to her ear, then placed it back on the table, as she proceeded to speak to the rest of the place setting. It was all Beast could do not to laugh.
Belle, I don't use the living ones to eat with,
he explained, nose suddenly wrinkling at such a repulsive thought. Oh, of course not, she said in some embarrassment, even as she sighed in further relief. The beast pursed his lips, feeling the lingering smile playing over his face, as he looked back at his own food. He wasn't so worried how he looked anymore, thinking it might not be so bad to have someone share the occasional meal with in the future. He looked up again, watching Belle smile as she swallowed her first spoonful of stew. This is good, she breathed, closing her eyes and sighing as if she had forgotten that he was there.
No, he thought warmly, dipping back into his own supper. This won't be so bad at all.
Belle hummed in content as they rose from their seats and watched a couple of tall wooden coat racks clear away the remaining dishes. She'd certainly never eaten so much in all her life, but having gone hungry for so long, couldn't find it in her heart to refuse the servants' offers to refill her bowl or offer more of that warm bread several times over the course of the supper. The food itself wasn't particularly elegant. A simple, heavy soup of vegetables and venison, with what tasted like a few basic spices mixed in. It seemed they were limited to whatever ingredients were contained in the castle's cellars or grown in the fields, and she quietly assumed what could be hunted in the surrounding woods. However, the food was warm and comforting, and she could tell whoever made it clearly had a skill in using the best of whatever was available to him. Who made our dinner, master? She asked as they moved through the halls.
That would be Chef Bouche. Did you enjoy it?
He asked, though the small smile on his face seemed to suggest he already knew the answer. "Oh, yes, very much," she said in chagrin, realizing it probably wasn't very ladylike to eat 4 helpings in one sitting.
"Well, I can tell you that nothing would make Boosh happier than to hear you say that."
Belle smiled, making a mental note to find the chef and thank him soon. The castle was quite dark by now. Only a few sconces lit their way along to the library. In the shadows, Belle noticed several dozen portraits lining the walls. All human, she noted. The beautiful painted figures draped in royal robes while wearing looks of utter boredom. She was so distracted by their stares that by the time they reached the pair of enormous doors, Belle was completely turned around. Yes, I definitely would have gotten lost, she realized, feeling a strange sense of excitement at the thought of exploring the mysterious halls on her own. Of course, the sight of the library put any thoughts of leaving that room to rest. "Master, this is incredible," she breathed, taking in the shelves full of books that climbed up into the darkness. The last bits of evening sun sent shadows across the large room. The quiet sounds of a crackling fire and the turning of pages filled the space as a few animated objects took advantage of the reading material for themselves. "I can't believe it. I've never seen so many books in all my life," she continued with a quiet reverence. I don't even know where to start." The beast moved quietly towards the desk near the hearth, taking a long minute to select several large bundles of parchment from the shelves before returning to her side.
"Here," he offered,
handing her the top stack. Belle took the loosely bound sheets and looked at them curiously, noticing the words English Drama printed in a clean penmanship across the top of the first page. Glancing to the stack in his arms, she noticed the next couple of stacks labelled Medieval Allegory and Art History, respectively.
"It's an index. It's still incomplete, but it may help,"
he explained, shrugging his shoulders. Belle looked back down at the first list with wonder, settling into a chair by the fire as she went through its pages. Several sheets were dictated to each letter of the alphabet, the titles roughly organized by the author's name and clearly written by several different scribes. The top pages were yellowed with time, the titles, authors, and locations penned in a neat cursive. Further along, however, the pages grew brighter, the writing changing to a light, steady stroke, before eventually ending with heavy scratches of a childish hand. "How many books are there, my lord?" she asked in awe. She turned through the massive list in her arms. Only one of several dozen at least by the looks of the shelves over the desk.
"We've recorded about 40,000,
he stated, setting a few more heavy stacks on a nearby table.
"But there's still a good third to go, I believe."
Belle's eyes grew wide. 40,000? It took her a moment before she could register the rest of his words. "Who's we?" she asked curiously, glancing back at the various writing styles of the index. The beast bit his lip.
"These books have been collected for generations by the royal family," he explained blankly. "King Xavier felt a record of the collection would enhance its value. At first, several scribes were hired for the process, but the project was soon abandoned. That is until He stopped, swallowing roughly before continuing. "Until the most recent rulers revived it. They did much of the work themselves, for..."
He paused again, looking at the fire.
"For they had a passion for it."
Belle watched him carefully, knowing there was much he wasn't saying, but nervous more questions would make him shut down again. "And now you're working on it?" she asked instead.
He affirmed,
glancing back to the bundle in her lap.
"Though it's fairly slow work and fairly tedious. I'd rather just read the books, to be honest."
He shrugged, putting his hands in his pockets as he stared back at the flames. Belle looked back up at the lines of scratched-in titles at the bottom of the pages. No doubt it must be difficult to write with giant paws. It didn't take her long to make up her mind. "I'll help you," she said a moment later. He turned back to her suddenly.
"What?"
"I'll help you with the index," she explained. "I can finish with the animals in the morning, and then I'll work on this in the afternoons."
"You really?"
he asked. His eyes grew bright. and for the first time Belle noticed they were a stunning shade of blue.
I mean, you don't have to,
He backtracked, suddenly scratching the back of his neck at the top of his head.
It's quite boring, and...
I want to be useful. And it's going to get colder soon. I'd rather not be outside all day, she admitted, though it was mostly an excuse to get him to agree.
No, you shouldn't be. Of course not.
He nodded seriously. Belle grinned in achievement as the realization of her new task flooded her. To just get to touch so many books. It would seem like a dream.
It's not right for a woman to read. Soon she gets getting ideas and thinking.
Her nose wrinkled as Gaston's words flooded her mind. Such a Philistine, she thought in disgust, though it wasn't an uncommon opinion in the village. They're all Philistines, she panted, before glancing back at the beast. Belle suddenly realized he hadn't seemed at least bit affronted by her literacy. Did your mother read to you, my lord? She wondered aloud.
You froze in place. Pardon? He asked nervously.
I'm sorry, she backpedaled, realizing she may have gone too far. I assumed since you weren't offended by me reading so much.
Why would that offend me?
He said, seeming genuinely confused. I'm very glad it doesn't, she said sincerely. I'm afraid most in our village see things differently. When he looked curious, she went on. There's a small school in town, and when I was 7, I tried to attend. I showed up on the first day of class with the other boys. She stopped, an unexpected lump in her throat at the memory. What are you doing here, Belle? Belle held a small blackboard against her chest, with one hand and a brand new stick of chalk in the other, sucking in a deep breath as she kept her eyes glued to the school's front door. You're not allowed to be here. My papa told me so. The boy continued, sticking his freckled nose in the air. Yeah, didn't they tell you? Another chimed in. It's only for boys. Stupid. Laughter rang in the air. Stupid girl, a few shouted in reply. Belle pursed her lips, eyes unmoving, as she tried her best to ignore them. She lost focus as someone bumped into her shoulder. Go home, one of them huffed. Another pair of hands knocked her off balance as she fell to her knees. Stop! Belle gasped, reaching for the piece of chalk that had fallen from her hands. She was too late as a shiny black shoe ground it into dust. She felt her eyes filling with tears just as the door swung open before them. What's all this ruckus? The schoolmaster barked, a sharp snap in the air as he smacked the door frame with a long, flat stick. Inside, now! As the boy scampered past him, Belle stood quickly, brushing her eyes on her sleeve as she tried to follow. As she reached the top of the stairs, she found the stick blocking her way. May I help you? The man asked coolly. Staring at the floor, she nodded. I'm here for school, Professor, she said simply. Belle's heart fell to her stomach as he too laughed at her. My dear girl, you must be confused. Now run along home to your mother. But Papa told me to come, she gasped as the sharp pain on the back of her hand, freezing in place as the man pulled the stick back to his side. I didn't say you could speak, he snarled, moving back inside. Even if you could attend, you are clearly not the kind of people I would tolerate here. He finished, shutting the door on her without another word. Without entirely realizing it, Belle had shared the story with the master.
My God,
he said as she finished, eyes growing wide in anger. Belle laughed a bit as she absently rubbed the back of her hand. Papa had a similar reaction. He came home with a black eye that evening. Swears he would have won the fight too if the man hadn't brought along his friends. And he wouldn't stop talking about it for weeks. Went on and on about how he paid taxes, how the schoolmaster was breaking the law.
He was, the beast interrupted. By the ordinance of Louis the Grand in 1698, you should have had the right to schooling until you were 14,
he said earnestly, slamming his fist on the mantel before pacing back and forth the fire. Belle was surprised by his reaction. Until now he had been nothing but reserved. She smiled a bit. His righteous fury was endearing, if a bit naive. Laws are easy to make, my lord, she went on calmly. Custom, I'm afraid, is much harder to change. He stopped in his pacing, looking back at her intently.
Then what is a ruler to do? He asked,
as if expecting her to know the answer. Belle smiled in amusement. I haven't a clue, my lord. I'm only a farmer's daughter, after all. He chewed on his lip for a moment before looking back to the stack of indices he had left her on the desk.
Let's begin with history,
he huffed, moving quickly towards the pile and digging through it. Grabbing one of the bundles and a nearby candle, he stopped suddenly, looking apologetic.
If that's all right with you,
he amended belatedly. Of course, she agreed, following him as he led them towards a section on the second level. He stopped as they reached the top of the stairs, his back to her in the darkness.
She did,
he whispered suddenly, resting a paw on one of the shelves as he spoke. What? Belle asked in confusion.
My mother,
he explained quietly, staring at the books as he ran an absent finger along their bindings.
You were right. She did read to me.
Belle watched him carefully, feeling the weight of his words. She sounds like a wonderful mother.
She was. Mrs. Potts?
The old teapot said sleepily, cracking one porcelain eye open from when she dozed off.
Mrs. Potts, I need your help.
Yes, master? What is it? The beast furrowed his large brows.
Well, Belle has fallen asleep in the library. And I'm not sure what to do.
The woman chuckled. Then, my dear, you must wake her up.
I tried, he said seriously.
Mrs. Potts raised a brow.
Well, sort of. I whispered her name a few times,
he explained somewhat lamely. Well now, that won't work. She smiled. Just shake her shoulders gently. That'll do the trick. She stopped as the master shook his head.
I don't want to frighten her, he said quietly, ducking his head. Please, can't you do it, Mrs. Potts?
She sighed. All right, love. Just this once. He smiled, picking her up carefully as they made their way back into the library. He remained quiet, though the old pog could sense the lightness in his steps. It's nice to have a new face around here, isn't it? Mrs. Potts observed as they wound their way through the halls.
The beast agreed.
She seems like a lovely person, too.
The master sighed. Mrs. Potts, he started, raising a brow. I'm no fool. I know what you're thinking. What everyone is thinking.
Well, of course you do, she said with a small smile. But I was being honest. I do think she is a dear girl. The beast suddenly stopped in his tracks, shoulders slouching in the quiet hall. Master, what is it? Mrs. Potts asked anxiously, unable to see his expression, but sensing the change in spirit in an instant.
Mrs. Potts, he started quietly, do you think this is wrong?
What do you mean, love? He was quiet for a long minute, his deep, raspy breaths filling the space around them before he spoke.
I feel like I'm deceiving her, he admitted. Using her.
Mrs. Potts was quiet, sensing he had more to say as he swallowed roughly.
At first, I just saw her as a way to get us back to normal. But now I'm realizing that that I could actually...
He trailed off, unable, or perhaps unwilling, to put his thoughts into words. Mrs. Potts was about to speak, but he quickly shook his head.
It doesn't matter either way, I suppose. It's not as though she'll ever see me like that.
She may surprise you, said Mrs. Potts gently. She already treats all of us, like there were nothing amiss. He nodded, staring blankly into the darkness.
It's funny,
he went on a moment later.
But tonight, for the first time in years, I almost felt human.
I'm glad, dear, she said warmly. I'm glad. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that because, oh my days, that scene with the bullying when she was at the school, that sounds atrocious. I myself have been the victim of bullies throughout the years, but never has a teacher hit me. I can't believe that was ever legal, ever, in any country. It shakes me to my core every time I learn something new about that kind of thing. But nice things about this chapter. I like that all the servants are treating Belle so well. They don't just see her as a way to break the spell, they're seeing her as a person, which is very nice. And the way she was eating, because she hasn't eaten so well, and that she was able to pick up that that's what they were able to make with what they can grow and what is in the cellar, that shows her intelligence. And just everything about this is so nice. I love this story so much. Anyway, remember to check out my other videos, like, comment and subscribe, hit that bell to get notified, and have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Bye!